The planet of Kalora was a rough place, even by galactic standards. Most who found themselves there either had nowhere else to go or were seeking something they couldn't find anywhere else: wealth, anonymity, or both. It was a world of endless deserts, jagged mountains, and desolate outposts. The only law was enforced by whichever local gang held power at the time, and mercy was a rare commodity. When the freighter dropped from hyperspace into Kalora's orbit, its landing was barely noticed by the traders and miners scattered around the outskirts of the main settlement. Ships came and went constantly, mostly smugglers and scavengers looking to trade goods on the black market. But there was something different about this particular ship. It wasn't large or flashy, just a plain, weathered vessel that looked like it had seen better days. When the ramp lowered, a single man walked down. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his clothes were worn and dusty. A long coat trailed behind him, brushing the dusty ground, and a wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face. But it wasn't the man that caught the attention of those nearby, it was the creature that followed him. A large, muscular dog trotted at his side, easily the size of a small horse. Its fur was a mix of black and brown, and its yellow eyes glinted with an intelligence that unsettled anyone who dared to look too closely. The dog moved with a fluid grace, its powerful body coiled with restrained energy, as though it was ready to spring into action at any moment. Its mere presence seemed to command the attention of everyone around. The locals were quick to give the stranger a wide berth, muttering amongst themselves. "Who's that?" "Sss. I've heard rumors. They say he's dangerous. Some kind of mercenary, a killer. But the dog's something else." The stranger, who they would come to know as Jacob Ryland, didn't pay any attention to the murmurs. He kept his pace slow and steady, his eyes scanning the settlement. He'd been to places like this before, dusty, lawless, and filled with people who would slit your throat for a few credits. But that didn't bother him. He wasn't here to make friends, and he didn't plan on staying long. The dog Rex stayed close to Jacob's side, his massive head turning occasionally to sniff the air or watch a passing figure with a keen, intelligent gaze. Jacob scratched the back of Rex's ears as they walked, the simple gesture calming both of them. Rex had been with Jacob for years, long enough that neither of them needed to speak to understand one another. They were more than just a man and his pet, they were a team, bound by an unspoken loyalty and trust. They made their way through the settlement until they reached the local tavern, a small, grimy building on the edge of town. The windows were caked with dust, and the wooden sign creaked ominously in the dry wind. Jacob pushed open the door, and the stench of stale beer and sweat hit him immediately. Inside, a handful of rough-looking patrons sat around wooden tables, most of them too focused on their drinks to notice the newcomer. Rex padded in after Jacob, his claws clicking softly on the floor. The few people who did notice the dog quickly straightened up, their conversations halting mid-sentence. One man, a grizzled miner with a scar down his face, looked at Rex and immediately pushed his chair back, muttering something under his breath. Jacob approached the bar and leaned on the counter. The bartender, a short, stocky man with a greasy apron, eyed him warily. "What'll it be?" the bartender asked, his eyes flicking nervously between Jacob and Rex. "Water," Jacob replied. "For both of us." The bartender raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He filled a glass and placed it on the counter before grabbing a metal bowl and filling it with water, setting it down for Rex. Jacob took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't here for a drink, though. He was looking for someone, a man named Roland Storn. Storn had a bounty on his head that had grown over the years to an impressive sum. Jacob had taken jobs like this before, hunting down criminals who had made their homes in places where the law didn't reach. Kalora was one of those places, and Roland Storn was known to operate out of this very settlement. As Jacob drank, he could feel the weight of several eyes on him. It was only natural strangers didn't come to Kalora without attracting attention. He was used to it. People often assumed things about him based on his appearance, his size, or the way he carried himself. He didn't mind. Let them talk. What mattered was getting the job done and leaving this place behind. Rex, meanwhile, lapped at the water in his bowl, his ears twitching as he listened to the conversations happening around them. Despite his relaxed posture, Rex was always alert, always aware. Jacob trusted Rex's instincts more than his own sometimes, and when Rex lifted his head suddenly, eyes locking onto a figure at the far end of the tavern, Jacob knew something was about to happen. A man stood up from one of the corner tables. He was tall, with a shaved head and a series of tattoos running down his arms. His eyes were hard, and the sneer on his face made it clear that he had taken an immediate dislike to Jacob and Rex. "You're the one they've been talking about," the man said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone in the tavern. "The so-called monster hunter who thinks he's going to waltz in here and collect a bounty." Jacob didn't respond right away. He set his glass down slowly and turned to face the man, his eyes cold and unreadable. Rex shifted slightly, positioning himself between Jacob and the man, his yellow eyes fixed on the stranger. The man took a step forward, clearly trying to intimidate Jacob. "This is Storn's territory, friend. You don't walk in here and act like you own the place without consequences." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jacob said calmly. "Just here for Storn. Once I find him, I'll be on my way." The man laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed through the room. "You think it's that easy, huh? Storn doesn't want to be found, and people around here don't take kindly to bounty hunters sniffing around." Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I don't care what Storn wants. I'm going to find him, and you're not going to stop me." The room fell silent as the tension between the two men grew. The patrons watched with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. The man sneered again and reached for something at his belt, a blade, long and curved, flashing in the dim light of the tavern. "Then I guess you'll have to learn the hard way." But before the man could make a move, Rex growled a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire room. The man froze, his eyes flicking down to the massive dog standing in front of Jacob. Rex's lips curled back, revealing sharp teeth, and his body tensed, ready to spring. For a moment, the man seemed to reconsider his actions. His gaze shifted between Jacob and Rex, weighing his options. But pride, or perhaps sheer stupidity, got the better of him. He lunged at Jacob, the blade flashing toward him. Rex moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. In a single, fluid motion, the dog launched himself at the man, teeth sinking into his arm before the blade could even reach Jacob. The man screamed, dropping the knife as Rex's jaws clamped down with terrifying force. Jacob didn't flinch. He stepped aside, watching as Rex pinned the man to the ground with ease, his powerful body coiled over the would-be attacker. The man writhed beneath the dog, his face twisted in pain, but Rex didn't release his grip. The entire tavern was silent, every eye on the scene unfolding before them. The miner with the scar shifted nervously in his seat, clearly reconsidering any thoughts of getting involved. "Rex," Jacob said quietly. The dog immediately released the man's arm and stepped back, though he remained poised, ready to strike again if necessary. The man lay on the floor, clutching his bleeding arm, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely. "I told you," Jacob said, his voice low and even. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but if you get in my way, you'll regret it." Without another word, Jacob turned and walked out of the tavern, Rex trotting at his side. The other patrons remained frozen in place, unwilling to meet Jacob's gaze. No one dared to stop him. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the settlement. Jacob moved toward the edge of town, his mind focused on the task ahead. Rex padded along beside him, his body still tense, though his ears twitched as he listened to the sounds around them. "You think that'll keep them off our backs?" Jacob asked, glancing down at Rex. Rex huffed in response, a sound that Jacob had come to interpret as agreement. "Good," Jacob said. "We've got work to do." They continued in silence for a while, the desert stretching out before them. Jacob's mind was sharp, calculating. He knew that finding Roland Storn wouldn't be easy, but the man had made enemies in the wrong places. There were whispers of a hideout, deep in the mountains, an old mining facility that had long been abandoned. If Storn was hiding anywhere, it would be there. By the time they reached the base of the mountains, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, and the desert was cloaked in darkness. Jacob and Rex moved with the ease of seasoned hunters, their footsteps light and purposeful. The air was cool, and the stars above provided just enough light to guide them. As they ascended the rocky path, Jacob's mind drifted briefly to the life he had once lived before the bounties, before the constant chase. He had been a soldier once, fighting in wars that now seemed so distant and meaningless. But after the war, he had found himself adrift, a man with no purpose. That was when Rex had come into his life. He had found the dog injured, starving on a battlefield, long after the fighting had ended. Rex had been little more than a pup then, but even in his weakened state, there had been something in the dog's eyes, something fierce, something unbreakable. Jacob had nursed him back to health, and from that day on they had been inseparable. The bounties had come later, when Jacob realized that his skills as a tracker and a fighter could be put to use in ways that made him more money than he ever could have imagined. It wasn't an easy life, but it was one that suited him. And with Rex by his side, there was no job too dangerous, no bounty too difficult. By the time they reached the entrance to the old mining facility, Jacob was fully focused on the task at hand. The facility was little more than a collection of rusted-out buildings, half buried in the side of the mountain. The wind whistled through the narrow canyons, carrying with it the faint scent of machinery and stale air. Jacob crouched behind a boulder, scanning the area. There were a few guards stationed near the entrance, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. They were armed, but their posture was relaxed, as though they didn't expect any trouble. Rex lowered himself to the ground beside Jacob, his body still and silent. Jacob rested a hand on the dog's back, feeling the tension in his muscles. "We'll have to do this quietly," Jacob whispered, his eyes on the guards. "Think you can handle that?" Rex didn't move, but Jacob knew the answer. Together, they had taken down far worse than a handful of guards. Jacob moved first, slipping from his hiding place and making his way toward the nearest building. He kept low, his steps careful and measured. Rex followed at his side, his body moving like a shadow. They reached the first guard without a sound, and before the man could react, Jacob had him in a chokehold, dragging him into the shadows. Rex dispatched the second guard just as silently, his powerful jaws closing around the man's throat before he could raise an alarm. The two remaining guards didn't even have time to realize what was happening before they were taken down as well. Once the entrance was clear, Jacob signaled for Rex to follow him inside. The interior of the facility was just as dilapidated as the outside: rusted walls, broken machinery, and the faint smell of decay. But there were signs of recent activity: footprints in the dust, discarded food wrappers, and the hum of a generator somewhere deeper within. Jacob moved cautiously through the corridors, his senses on high alert. Rex stayed close, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The deeper they went, the more they began to hear the murmur of voices, the clink of metal, the faint sound of footsteps. They were close. Jacob paused at the entrance to a large chamber, his eyes scanning the scene before him. It was a makeshift command center, with tables and monitors set up around the room. At the far end of the chamber, standing next to a large console, was Ryland. The man was just as Jacob had imagined: tall, lean, with a face that spoke of years spent in the shadows. His hair was graying at the temples, and a long scar ran down the side of his neck. He was flanked by a handful of armed men, each of them looking equally hardened. This was it, the moment Jacob had been waiting for. But before he could make his move, something unexpected happened. Rex, who had been silent and focused until now, suddenly tensed, his ears flattening against his head. He let out a low growl, a sound so deep and menacing that it sent a chill down Jacob's spine. Jacob's eyes flicked to the other side of the room, where a large metal cage stood. Inside the cage, something moved, something massive. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but the creature's outline was unmistakable. It was a dog, larger than Rex, with matted fur and glowing red eyes. Its body was scarred and emaciated, but there was a terrifying strength in its movements. Jacob's stomach twisted. He had seen creatures like this before, genetically modified, bred for combat. This wasn't a natural animal. It was a weapon. Ryland turned toward the cage, a cruel smile on his face. "You're not the only one with a dog, Ryland," he called out, his voice echoing through the chamber. "But mine's a little more enhanced." Jacob's mind raced. He had heard rumors of illegal experimentation on animals, but he hadn't expected to encounter one of these beasts here. And judging by the look on Rex's face, this was no ordinary fight. Storn stepped back from the console and pressed a button. The cage door swung open with a metallic screech, and the massive dog stepped out, its glowing red eyes fixed on Jacob and Rex. "Let's see how your mutt fares against mine," Storn said, his voice dripping with malice. The room was filled with tension as the two dogs sized each other up. Rex's muscles were coiled, his teeth bared, but Jacob could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't a fight they had planned for. The enhanced dog lunged first, its movements lightning fast despite its size. Rex dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the beast's snapping jaws. The two dogs circled each other, their growls filling the chamber. Jacob kept his eyes on Storn, who was watching the fight with sadistic glee. He couldn't let this drag out. Rex was strong, but the other dog was a monster. If they didn't end this quickly, it could go badly. Without hesitating, Jacob drew his blaster and fired at the console Storn had been using. Sparks flew as the console short-circuited, causing the lights in the chamber to flicker. Storn's expression twisted into anger, but before he could react, Jacob was already moving. He fired again, taking down one of Storn's men before they could raise their weapons. The chamber erupted into chaos. Storn's men scrambled for cover, shouting orders to one another. But Jacob was faster. He moved through the room with precision, picking off the guards one by one, his blaster shots echoing through the chamber. Meanwhile, Rex and the enhanced dog were locked in a brutal struggle. The two animals collided with bone-crushing force, teeth flashing and claws raking through fur. Rex was faster, more agile, but the enhanced dog was relentless, its glowing eyes filled with rage. Jacob took down the last of Storn's guards and turned to face the man himself. Storn, realizing that he was outmatched, backed toward the exit, his hand reaching for a weapon at his side. "You're not going anywhere," Jacob growled, stepping forward with his blaster aimed at Storn's chest. But before he could pull the trigger, the enhanced dog let out a furious howl, and Rex was thrown against the wall with a sickening thud. The monster turned its attention toward Jacob, its eyes glowing with fury. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. Rex struggled to get back on his feet, his body battered and bleeding, but there was no time to waste. The enhanced dog was coming for him now, and it wasn't going to stop. Jacob raised his blaster and fired at the beast, but the shot barely slowed it down. The dog's modified body was too strong, too fast. It lunged at him, its jaws snapping inches from his face. But just as the beast was about to strike, Rex launched himself at the monster, sinking his teeth into the back of its neck with all the strength he had left. The enhanced dog let out a roar of pain, thrashing wildly as Rex held on, refusing to let go. Jacob saw his chance. He sprinted toward the two dogs, his blaster in hand, and fired directly into the enhanced dog's head. The beast went still, its body collapsing to the ground in a heap. Rex released his grip, stumbling back, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Jacob rushed to Rex's side, kneeling beside him. "You okay, buddy?" Rex let out a low whine, but he wagged his tail weakly, his yellow eyes filled with relief. Jacob smiled, running a hand over Rex's bloodied fur. "You did good, Rex, real good." Storn, who had been watching the entire scene in stunned silence, tried to make a run for it, but Jacob wasn't about to let him get away. He leveled his blaster at the man's back and fired. Storn collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The chamber fell silent, the only sound the soft panting of Rex as he lay beside Jacob. Jacob took a deep breath, the adrenaline slowly fading from his veins. It was over. He stood up, glancing around the chamber. The facility was abandoned now, the guards and Storn all dead. It wasn't a clean job, but it was done. "Let's get out of here," Jacob said, giving Rex a gentle pat on the head. Rex struggled to his feet, limping slightly but still determined to follow his partner. Together, they made their way out of the facility and back into the cool night air of Kalora. The stars above were bright, and the wind carried with it the faint scent of the desert. Jacob glanced down at Rex, who was walking beside him with his usual stoic determination. "They called me the monster," Jacob muttered, more to himself than to Rex. "But it was you they should have feared." Rex huffed in agreement, his yellow eyes glinting in the starlight. They had faced death together many times before, and they would face it again. But for now they had each other, and that was all that mattered.